to start with the Morphew case, if you guys know what that is. Suzanne Morphew went missing in May of 2020 in Colorado. This case has spanned about 5 years now. And at that time, people had their eyes, their suspicion on her husband, Barry Morphew. This is a case that started near the Colorado Springs area, but quickly gained national attention because people were kind of looking at Suzanne, what was their life like, what was their marriage life, and why would she go missing? They have 2 beautiful daughters, they were teens at the time, and so it was very odd. In May of 2021, Barry Morphew was arrested for her murder, but at that time, Suzanne's remains were still not found. Nobody knew where she was. And I think a lot of people watching probably know this, but I always try to kind of give some context. It is very hard to prosecute a nobody homicide case. Even if you think you have other evidence, it is all circumstantial for the most part, unless you have those remains. So in April of 2022, a judge dismissed the case, but without prejudice, which means that they can refile the case if they find more evidence or something new comes to light. In September of 2023, Suzanne Morphew's remains were found in Colorado, south of their home. And when they tested her remains and did the autopsy, they found something odd in her system, a chemical called BAM. Now, BAM is used to tranquilize deer. Why is that important? Because Barry Morphew was a deer farmer in Indiana and at one point had access to that chemical. So in June of this year, so just a couple months ago, Barry Morphew was rearrested for Suzanne's murder, but this time he was arrested here in Arizona. A lot of people didn't know that Barry had relocated down here. He was living in the Cave Creek area in a trailer. We later learned through court documents and police investigation. And he was extradited from Maricopa County back to Colorado to now face these charges. Again, this case has some extremely bizarre aspects to it. For one thing, we learned through the investigation that Suzanne was skeptical of Barry having an affair, so much so that she bought a spy pen that could record a conversation or record something like that for Barry. But Barry also was suspicious that Suzanne was having an affair. Both of them had alleged infidelity, and there was a bizarre GPS tracking situation going on Barry's phone. When investigators were looking at it, the day that Suzanne went missing, his phone showed this location of all over their property and all over their house, almost in circles, just like that. And they thought possibly he was chasing Suzanne around at that time. He told investigators he was chasing a chipmunk around the property, which is also what? So bizarre, so many strange aspects to this case. Their daughters vehemently support Barry. They do not believe that he killed Suzanne Morphew, which it really complicates this entire case, and it is very perplexing to so many people who have been following this nationwide. Why are we talking about this week? Barry had a bond hearing. This becomes important because this is whether he's going to stay in jail or not before a murder trial. His bond was originally set at $3 million cash only, which means up front you got to pay the $3 million in order to get out. His defense team wanted to lower that bond to $500,000. Much different. Going into the hearing, Suzanne's brother had actually written a victim impact statement and submitted it to the judge. And I just want to read a couple words that he said. This is David Mormon, Suzanne's brother. And he wrote, quote, "She now understood her death was a symbolic culmination of her marriage, one where she was nothing but a live trophy for public display by a cunning predator, much like the animal trophies he had displayed on the walls." He also wrote to the judge, "I am requesting a life sentence with no chance of parole. If the truth were acknowledged, Barry Morphew is a soulless, sadistic, amoral predator that has hunted or used those around him his entire life." Those were extremely powerful words, something that the judge could take into account before the hearing. So the judge had that. Then both parties were in the courtroom in Alamosa County to then argue whether his bond should stay at $3 million or whether it should be lowered to $500,000. Now, this is an interesting aspect because we hadn't had some of these details before. But basically, the state said that Barry had been doing some weird things since in jail. For example, they said he's been conducting business in Arizona still from behind bars, but under the name of Lee Moore. They said he's been transferring large sums of money into other people's names. And of course, they say at this time, this case is a lot different because Suzanne's remains were found, and that's a huge aspect in this case. The defense is trying to say, or is at least arguing, that this is not that much of a different case from the first time, and that, this should be a lot different. He was released the first time. The state says, okay, yeah, but Suzanne's remains weren't found in that first case. So clearly there's so much more that's different. You have the body now. So they're arguing this in court. And I want to play both sides of things because, of course, kind of the center of this whole case is whether or not Barry Morphew potentially, allegedly, used that BAM chemical to kill his wife, Suzanne. And I want to play what the state said. You're going to see this footage from behind the scenes within the courtroom this week, but the state got up there and presented first. This is what they had to say.
The remains of Suzanne Morphew after an autopsy contained a chemical compound that Mr. Morphew had almost exclusive access to, tying him directly to the remains of his wife. The case in 2021 was arguably entirely circumstantial with no body. This case is very different.
Okay, so that's what the state was saying. Obviously you have a circumstantial case versus direct evidence. Direct evidence is going to be huge. And in this case, that's now what you have with Suzanne being found. That is the crux of the information that we had heard over and over, was that he had exclusive access to this BAM chemical, that nobody else in basically the state of Colorado had any other access to this. So nobody else would have been able to put that in Suzanne's body or use that in any sort of capacity. What was new in this hearing was what the defense rebutted with, basically trying to talk about the fact of when Barry had access to this chemical, which was not at the time that Suzanne went missing. So I want to play what the defense said in argument to that.
The BAM that the district attorney mentions that Mr. Morphew had access to, I want to be clear on, was prescribed to him in the state of Indiana in 2018. Mr. Morphew has not had access to BAM since 2018, and the indictment says that nobody in the immediate region, meaning the 12th Judicial District, who was not otherwise lawfully prescribed BAM, had access to BAM, leaving out the fact that Mr. Morphew himself has not had access or prescription to BAM since 2018, and ultimately law enforcement did not find any BAM in Mr. Morphew's residence, in his garage, or in his gun safe. And so this narrative that the people put in their indictment that Mr. Morphew has ties to and access to BAM, and is completely silent to the fact that that was an out-of-state prescription legally prescribed to him for a deer farm that he had not owned in years.
Okay, so the defense obviously talking about the fact that Suzanne disappeared 2 years after Barry allegedly had access to that BAM chemical. So what came of this hearing? Well, the judge listened to everything, and interestingly enough, the judge said something about the fact that Barry's 2 daughters were sitting behind him in that hearing, and she noted that that meant something to her, that she took that into account, that the couple's kids support Barry in this entire endeavor. But she did keep the bond at $3 million. Not cash only, though. Basically now it's a secured bond, which means that if Barry Morphew can find $300,000 to pay up front, then he could potentially bail out even on this murder charge. And it's been widely known that Barry has had access to large amounts of money. So it is definitely not out of the question that Barry Morphew could bond out any day now. And that's something that a lot of people following the case are watching. However, his defense attorney had said he would like to return back here to Arizona. And the judge said no. So there's a couple conditions. He's going to have to wear an ankle monitor if he does make bond. He can't leave his house for any reason except to appear in court or for medical issues. He must only use the name Barry Morphew. He cannot go by Lee Moore to conduct any of that business. And he may not leave Colorado for any reason. So we will not see Barry Morphew back here in Arizona unless he is acquitted of this crime and then comes back here after. But that's what the judge decided. So far, he has not bonded out. Would not be surprised, though, if he finds a way to do so. I want to bring in our live interview this week. This is Alexis Dominguez, one of the reporters here in Arizona. But Alexis, throughout your reporting career, you were a reporter in Colorado Springs, and you were working there when Suzanne first went missing. My understanding is this was a huge case in Colorado at the time. I know you said, though, to me that there was a lot going on with women getting murdered at the time and kind of these bizarre aspects. So I just want you to take us back to 2020. And we're talking about May of 2020, so COVID's also going on. What was this original investigation like from your end and your perspective? Were people looking at Barry from the start as a potential suspect?
Definitely. And I think the reason is it's basically because it came at a time where there were two other cases that were playing out that were huge cases, not just in Colorado, but nationwide. So the one that a lot of people know are Shanann and Chris Watts. That happened in 2018. And then that same year, there was another case, a woman named Kelsey Barrett. She went missing in 2018 on Thanksgiving Day. So fast forward to 2020, Mother's Day, and Suzanne Morphew goes missing. I think immediately everyone believed the husband may have something to do with it. And it really was just because of the two previous cases where the husband, Chris Watts, and then Kelsey Barrett's fiance, Patrick Frazee, were essentially number one suspects in those cases.
It's interesting and, yeah, easy to make that kind of connection or assumption. But if we're looking at the evidence, too, and even just their relationship, take out those other cases going on in Colorado, were you guys finding out pretty quickly these marital issues that Barry and Suzanne were having?
Yeah, they were pretty new to the area, so I think Suzanne at least was trying to make some new friends. At one point, we interviewed one of her friends, and she told us that while she was very private, there were rumors going around that Barry Morphew may have been verbally abusive and did have anger issues. So I think that was a big part of why it really stood out to people that, he may have had something to do with it.
What's your take on the BAM chemical? Listening to the state and the defense kind of give their arguments one way or the other, one saying he's the only person that had access, the defense saying he didn't have access at the time. In your professional opinion, do you think anybody else would have had access to this chemical that would have killed her?
It's hard to say. I think a lot of people believe that if he did have access to it, they were from Indiana and he could have gone back, known someone who was in Indiana who had access to BAM, or maybe still could have had it because he was the only person in Colorado who, would have, I guess, in Indiana, who would have had access to that. So I think it's not completely out of the question that he could have possibly brought it back from Indiana and still kept it in Colorado. But, it's hard to say.
Yeah. When they were searching for her, were you involved in any of the searches in the area? I mean, are we talking woods? Did we know if Barry or anybody else was familiar with these kind of wooded areas where you would, put remains if that was something you were trying to do? I know her remains were found not terribly far, but south of that property, right?
Yeah, so I think the area where we know that she went mountain biking, that's a wooded area. So initially, a lot of people thought maybe she got hurt, maybe she fell off her bike. So the initial search when it came in that she was missing was really to find if perhaps she had fallen off her bike and was hurt and wasn't able to get back up. And once they found the bike in that wooded area, then it really became a case of, okay, why is her bike here? But she's missing, her cell phone's missing. Eventually, they ended up finding her car. In her car, they found her cell phone and her purse with her ID. They also found her camelback backpack, which would have had her water. So if she was going biking, then why were some of those things found in her car? And another thing I should mention is that Barry Morphew worked in construction. So a lot of people initially also thought, okay, where are the properties that he's currently working on? And there were rumors going around that people thought her remains may have actually been in concrete in the foundation of one of the homes that he had been working on.
Interesting. Obviously, they ended up finding them in a different place, but I mean, these are the things that are being discussed when this investigation starts. You know, the maybe most perplexing part of this entire case is the fact that their daughters have, you know, stood by him steadfast. They've, and almost in like a showy way too, they've been holding hands outside of court, things like that. They were sitting behind him in the hearing this week, which was a huge sign and show of support by them. You know, what do you take away from that? Suzanne's brother, in his victim impact statement letter, said that Barry has manipulated the daughters into maybe thinking he's innocent. What do you make of that?
Her sister, Suzanne Morphew's sister, had also said that Barry was emotionally abusive. A week before Suzanne went missing, she had texted her sister saying that she wanted out of the relationship, that he was being emotionally and verbally abusive. So I think it's fair to say that there is some sort of manipulation there. So it could be a case where he is also manipulating his two daughters. But that's definitely something that I think shocked a lot of people, especially because we know at least one of their daughters was supposedly very, very close to her mom. And Suzanne had even opened up to her about some of the abuse that she had gone through. So knowing that background, I think a lot of people were surprised to see that they still had their dad's back. And they even did an interview on Good Morning America where they backed him and they talked about what a great father he was. And then to see this case playing out now and to see that they're still supporting him, I think comes as a surprise to a lot of people, because at this point there have been a lot of things that have come out in this case that perhaps weren't really known when she initially went missing in 2020, and they were supporting their father.
Yeah, I think that was the biggest thing, was in that first case, her remains weren't found. So it was a little bit easier to say, hey, yeah, no, he was not involved in this. But now, obviously, with the remains found, it just changes things. And I think people were expecting possibly the daughters to not support him this second time once they found what they found in the autopsy and the BAM chemical within her system. So it is interesting. It's kind of like that family drama dynamic that we're watching play out in real time, but in a legal system setting. So it is fascinating from this perspective. I know you've been paying attention. I have as well. I appreciate you coming on the show, giving some of that insight just of how everything kind of started with this case and where we are now. I know we'll both be following this as it continues on to likely a trial. But I appreciate your insight. Thank you so much. And we appreciate everything you do for the reporting. So we'll talk to you soon, Alexis. Thanks again. And thanks to everybody who has been on the show so far.